Hello, and welcome to the next lesson in world history and our march through medieval Europe, the Crusades. You'll notice that I am attired as a crusading warrior, standing before the Crac des Chevaliers. Behind me is one of the most famous castles of the entire crusading era. The Crusades are often presented as a confusing time in European history, much loved in Hollywood videos. Most of the Hollywood videos on the Crusades are very, very bad. Unfortunately, movie people don't often read history books, but nonetheless, it's clearly a time period that captivates the imagination. It's a time period that also grows out of this new agricultural revolution. In a way, a time period of peace, a time period of greater agricultural production, of the rise of towns and trade. All of these things give rise to one of the most fascinating military ventures in human history, the Crusades. So come with me on our journey to the Holy Land as we recap what brought us here and give us a short overview of crusading history. One of the things that this has to be understood in the context of is the rise of Islam. By the early Middle Ages, remember, we talked about this in our World Religion Unit, Islam had conquered 2/3 of what had been Christian Europe, the Christian Mediterranean. Well, in the year 1071, just after the Viking invasions end and the agricultural revolution is starting, things pick up again. A new Muslim force, the Seljuk Turks, conquers Asia Minor, and they get within a stone's throw of Constantinople itself. Now, perhaps understandably, this makes the Byzantines over in Constantinople very concerned. They're afraid they're next in line, and they were probably right. And so the Byzantine emperor, in a panic, sends word to the Pope asking for help, asking the Pope to send him some soldiers who would help him defend Constantinople against this new Muslim force. The Byzantine emperor got more than he bargained for. In the year 1095, just a few years later, the Pope called a meeting of French nobles at the Council of Clermont in France. Some of you remember I mentioned this at the very beginning of the year. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II stands up and calls the Frankish nobles to make an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. His speech must have been, from the written reports we have, a magnificent call appealing to the European nobles to be more and be better than they are and go fight for Christ. He starts off flattering them. This is a good idea. When you want people to do something for you, you should always start out flattering them. So clearly he knew what he was doing. Franks, you are great, you are strong, you are powerful. God has given the victory to your strong right arm. Flattery, praising them for being great warriors. Then he kind of shames them a little. He says, but I regret to find that, what do I see? So many of you are fighting each other, fighting helpless peasants, robbing churches. You're killing each other for nothing. I am very disappointed in you, very disappointed indeed. Oh, and so now he's got them, he praised them, but now he's got them maybe feeling a little bad. But he says, listen, I have a task for you, a manly, heroic task. He tells them horror stories about Muslim attacks on the Byzantine Empire, even stories about Muslim soldiers attacking pilgrims. He says, here's what you should do. You were robbers, you were thieves, you're murderers, you're fighting each other. Now is your chance to be more than this. Now is your chance to become knights. He says, let those who were robbers now become knights. And he calls them to go on crusade, to make an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to go to the aid of Christ, just as vassals, see, they understood this, vassals go to the aid of their Lord. He says, basically, I am calling you to see Christ as your Lord and go to his aid. Go save the holy places where he grew up. Those of you who were robbers now become knights. He's calling them to a high ideal, not to fight anymore for loot, for land, for treasure, for reputation. He's saying, no, fight for God, fight for the salvation of your souls, fight for the aid of your Christian brethren in the Byzantine Empire who are being attacked. Be more than this, be better. And he calls them to go on crusade. And they are so excited by this idea, they take their cloaks and they immediately cut crosses out of their cloaks. And they take those crosses and attach them to their tunics as a sign of their oath to go on crusade. This is where the word crusader comes from. Crusader is from the word cruce signatus in Latin. Cruce signatus means signed by the cross. A crusader is one who wore the sign of the cross on his cloak as a sign of his promise to go fight in the Holy Land. Well, not only did the Byzantine emperor get more than he bargained for, the Pope got more than he bargained for, because he seems like he didn't realize just how much this was actually going to appeal to the Franks, because the response is absolutely overwhelming. When he finishes his speech, Franks start jumping up, shouting, God wills it, God wills it, Dieu le vole, Deus vult. 30 to 40,000 knights and foot soldiers go on this first crusade. There's a tremendous mystery here, because there's tremendous risk, tremendous expense. If you're of the crusaders who go on crusade, 2/3 of them die. Most of them don't come back. Most of them end up bankrupt. It's actually so dangerous. The Pope actually makes it illegal. He forbids crusaders from going unless they have their wife's permission, because they're so likely to die. So I guess if you were a wife and you really didn't like your husband, you could try to get him to go on crusade. This also leads to some funny scenarios where one knight actually doesn't want to go on crusade, and the local, I think it was a local priest, is kind of pushing him. Hey, why don't you go on crusade? All your friends are going. Come on, let's go. Go on crusade. Stop being such a wimp. He's like, yeah, I'd really like to. My wife won't let me. And the priest accuses him of being, whipped by his wife. So it's kind of an interesting puzzle. Why did so many people want to go when it was dangerous? And they knew it was dangerous, and they knew odds are they were not coming back, and they knew odds are they were going to become bankrupt. There are a lot of different reasons for this. Most of all, crusade starts to explain how it could be okay to actually be a warrior. It develops this idea of the Christian knight. Before, fighting is seen as a problem. Fighting is seen as something risky that risks your soul. Now, you have something good to fight for. You can fight for Christ. It offers a path of salvation to a tough German warrior. And maybe that's what was so important. So what was a crusade? Well, first of all, it had to be called by the Pope. Any random person can't just say, I'm going on crusade. The Pope had to declare a crusade. Second, a crusade was an armed pilgrimage. They actually don't call themselves crusaders at first. They call themselves pilgrims, if you read the sources. Now, it's a funny kind of pilgrimage, because it's a pilgrimage where the goal is to conquer territory, to conquer the holy places, but it's not quite as weird as it seems. Pilgrims were armed before. Going on pilgrimage was dangerous. You could be attacked by brigands or robbers. And so it's a sort of armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land. Pilgrimage being a holy or religious journey. So the idea is you're going on a holy journey to a holy site, and you're armed because you're going to try to reconquer that site. Third, crusaders took a vow. This is what it meant to be a crusader. It meant you were a cruce signatus. You wore the sign of the cross, and that was a sign that you had taken a vow to try to free the Holy Land. You got something else. You got an indulgence. This is thing number 4 that makes a crusade. The Pope promises all crusaders that if they went on crusade, they would receive an indulgence, which is similar to forgiveness for all of their sins. Most specifically, it's remission for the penalty associated with those sins, but it's similar to being forgiven for all of their sins. This must have been really attractive to those Frankish warriors because it's like offering salvation to people who were very afraid they were going to hell. Because they knew their violent, aggressive, warlike way of life was bad. They just couldn't stop doing it. So now there's a way to fight and actually have a shot at heaven. And so the First Crusade is overwhelmingly successful. It captures Jerusalem, it establishes a set of Crusader kingdoms, and the Crusaders managed to hold a lot of this territory for almost 200 years. It ebbs and flows. Around the year 1187, Muslims led by Saladin are able to recapture Jerusalem. This leads to the Third Crusade of King Richard the Lionheart. Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin is one of these classic images of two great generals fighting each other. Richard manages to recapture some territory, but not everything. Later, the Crusaders do manage to recapture Jerusalem again until the year 1291, when Muslim forces finally drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land for good. So the Crusades were this 200-year venture, really, when the Crusaders managed to go on this epic journey to capture the Holy Land. There's a lot of puzzle here. What drove these people to do it? What drove them to risk life and limb and fortune, knowing that it would drive most of them bankrupt, knowing that it would cause many of them to never see home again? But nonetheless, you can see why this has formed such an important image in European history and even in the popular mind. One of the things for us to think about will be what drove them to do it. How should we understand these Crusades? Next time, we'll talk more about this. And one of the groups that comes out of the Crusades, the warrior monks, the Templars.